The outsider among warriors' wind was sharp that morning as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the cold concrete runway of the Nato military base in Poland. Heavy clouds hung low, the kind that made everything feel distant, gray, and heavy with judgment. This wasn't a movie set. There were no cameras, no trailers, no red carpets. Just soldiers, armed guards, steel fences, and watchful eyes. Keanu had been invited to speak at a private leadership conference held for senior NATO officers. A rare event meant to boost morale and bridge the gap between civil and military leadership. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd been invited. He wasn't a general. He wasn't trained in war. He was an actor. A man known for playing heroes, not being one. And that's exactly why some didn't want him there as he walked past a group of uniformed men gathered near the hangar. He could feel the stares. Some were respectful. Most were not. Whispers followed him. What's John Wick doing here? He thinks movies make him a soldier. Keanu kept his head down, his steps steady, eyes calm. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because a letter had reached his team, written by a young NATO soldier who claimed that a single moment from one of Keanu's films had saved his life during combat. The letter was honest, raw, and painful, and Keanu had read it over and over until he knew he couldn't ignore it. Inside the main building, the atmosphere was stiff. Senior commanders filled the room. Flags lined the walls. A digital map glowed in the background. These were men and women who had seen war, who had made decisions that changed nations, and now, an actor was standing among them as Keanu walked to the front of the room. A colonel leaned toward another officer and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Let's see if Hollywood teaches battlefield courage." Laughter followed. Keanu stood at the podium. No teleprompter, no script. He took a breath and began. "I know I don't belong here," he said softly, "and maybe some of you think this is a joke, that I came here to pretend. But I'm not here to talk about movies. I'm here because one of your own reached out to me, because sometimes the quietest voice deserves the biggest room." The room fell silent. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter. This was written by Corporal Daniel Weiss, a young man stationed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. During a firefight, he got separated from his unit. He was injured, pinned down out of ammo, and bleeding. In those minutes, those terrifying minutes, he remembered a scene from one of my films. Not the fighting, not the killing, the moment when the character stops, breathes, and chooses not to give up. Again, paused. Corporal Weiss wrote, "I don't know why I thought of that scene. Maybe because I needed to believe I still mattered. Maybe because I needed a reason to stay alive. So I kept breathing. I stayed still. And someone found me." Keanu lowered the paper. "He's alive. And he asked me to thank the man who taught him never to give up." Keanu looked around the room. "But I didn't teach him that." "You did." He stepped away from the podium and sat back down. No applause. Just silence. But not everyone was convinced. During lunch, he sat alone at a metal table near the back. A few soldiers walked past him without a word. One young officer, in particular, Captain Moravec, gave him a smug glance and said, "In this place, people earn respect. They don't borrow it from movie roles." Keanu smiled politely. "You're absolutely right." Captain Moravec narrowed his eyes. "So what did you earn, Mr. Reeves?" Keanu's answer was simple. Enough humility to know when I don't belong, and enough heart to still show up. Before the captain could respond, another soldier entered the cafeteria, limping. He was thin, pale, with eyes that had seen more than his years allowed. Corporal Daniel Weiss. He scanned the room until his eyes found Keanu. Without hesitation, he walked over, saluted awkwardly, and sat down across from him. "I didn't think you'd really come," he said. Keanu looked at him and smiled gently. "You gave me a reason that mattered." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small patch. "This was mine," he said. "I want you to have it." Keanu shook his head. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not for what you did on screen," Daniel replied, voice low, "but for showing up when you didn't have to. That means more than you know." Just then, an announcement came over the base intercom. Supreme Allied Commander arriving.
Oh.
The room emptied quickly. As they arrived at the hangar, dozens of soldiers stood in lines, backs straight, boots sharp. Armored vehicles lined the far wall. Cameras were not allowed. This wasn't for media. This was NATO's highest ranking figure visiting his troops. The Supreme Commander, a tall American general named Samuel Briggs, entered with his escort. His presence was powerful, his expression unreadable. He walked past each row slowly, observing everything. Then he stopped in front of Keanu. Whispers moved like fire through the room. The commander looked him over. KeanuReeves. Keanu nodded. Sir, you don't wear a uniform. But you wear something more dangerous than rank, the commander said. You wear influence. He turned to the crowd. Some of you mocked his presence here. I know this because your microphones picked it up. Silence, the commander continued. We invite leaders not because they've seen war, but because they've seen people. Anyone who gives courage to a man about to die deserves a moment of respect. He turned back to Keanu. We honor you today, not as an actor, but as a man who showed up. Keanu said nothing. His eyes simply glistened with quiet emotion, but the silence broke. When Captain Moravec stepped forward and saluted. Permission to speak, sir? Granted. Moravec looked at Keanu. I judged you too quickly. You've done more with one act than most do with a uniform. He extended his hand. Keanu shook it firmly. Later that night, as Keanu packed his bag in the guest quarters, he heard a knock. It was Daniel again. I wanted to say one last thing, the young soldier said. Go. Ahead, Keanu said. I was alone that day in Afghanistan. But after you came here, I don't feel invisible anymore. Keanu looked at him, then quietly whispered, None of us should. Outside, snow began to fall gently on the base. But inside that room, a new warmth had settled, one born not from glory or fame, but from something far stronger, from respect earned by simply choosing to care. Asterisk the test. No one expect teeth next morning. Frost clung to the windows of the NATO base buildings like tiny frozen fingerprints. A light mist rolled across the concrete, giving everything a quiet, eerie calm. Inside the barracks, soldiers were already gearing up for field drills. Boots echoed in the halls. Radios buzzed with short, sharp commands. The energy was sharp, focused, and ready. KeanuReeves stood in front of the mirror in the guest quarters, buttoning his jacket. He had planned to quietly leave after his talk, maybe thank a few people, and disappear back into the world that made more sense to him. Sets, scripts, controlled scenes. But something in him had changed. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet. As he stepped outside, he spotted Corporal Daniel Weiss jogging slowly across the training yard, his limp still noticeable, but less pronounced. A few feet away, Captain Moravec barked instructions to a row of fresh recruits. He caught Keanu's eye and gave a brief, not as cold than before, maybe even respectful. Keanu nodded back. Just then, an announcement crackled over the loudspeaker. Attention all personnel. Due to unexpected weather delays, scheduled simulations for Team Alpha will now include an open participant exercise. Volunteers from approved civilians and visitors are permitted. Murmurs spread quickly. Captain Moravec smirked as he approached Keanu. You wanted to understand our world? How about you join today's simulation? Keanu blinked. Me, Moravec said. Non-combat scenario, hostage rescue. There's no real weapons. Just tactics, communication, and teamwork. Think of it as method acting. A few soldiers. Nearby chuckled. Keanu didn't smile. I'll do it. Moravec raised an eyebrow. You're serious? You invited me, Keanu said calmly. And just like that, the base watched as Hollywood's most humble man stepped into one of NATO's most advanced simulation drills. The drill was set up in a massive hangar, transformed into a maze of hallways, staircases, abandoned rooms, and smoke machines. Strobe lights simulated gunfire. Recorded shouts and cries echoed from hidden speakers. The mission was simple. A team of soldiers had to rescue a mock hostage trapped deep inside enemy territory. No GPS, no preset layout. Just instincts, strategy, and trust. Keanu was placed on a mixed team. Half of them were actual soldiers, including Daniel, who volunteered to join. The rest were junior officers observing the actor with curious, skeptical eyes. "Stay low," Daniel whispered, adjusting his headset. "Follow my lead if things get messy." "Copy that," Keanu said, trying not to feel out of place. The simulation began with a loud siren. The hangar lights dimmed, placed by a haunting red glow. They moved slowly through the maze, checking corners, signaling silently. At one point, a loud bang startled Keanu, and he instinctively ducked behind cover. One officer laughed. Guess the movies didn't prepare him for real panic. But Keanu didn't react. He kept moving. 10 minutes in, their team was split by a surprise barrier drop. Communication lines went fuzzy. Daniel and Keanu were stuck on one side, separated from the others. "We can't wait," Daniel said. "They'll need us at the extraction point." Keanu looked around. Smoke made it hard to see. Noises echoed from every direction. "We'll go around," he said, voice steady. Daniel paused. "You sure?" Keanu nodded. "You said follow your lead if it gets messy." "It's messy. I'm following." They took a side route, crawling through a tight shaft and dropping into an open space designed to look like a basement. Fake gunfire rang out, and Daniel winced as he twisted his bad leg. "You okay?" Keanu asked. "Just slow," Daniel said. Up over close. Just then they heard a scream, recorded but convincing. "The hostage," Keanu said. They crept toward the sound. In the center of the room was a dummy figure. Tied to a chair, sensors around it to simulate heartbeat and signs of stress. In simulation terms, you had to reach the figure without setting off motion alarms. Most failed here. Keanu looked at the floor-tiny laser tripwires crossed in every direction. "There's a pattern," he whispered. He studied the movement. Like a scene from a fight sequence but real, he took a breath and moved, step by step, not fast. Not dramatic, just focused. Daniel watched in silence as Keanu maneuvered through the traps, using breath control and body awareness that came not from pretending but from discipline. And finally, Keanu reached the chair. The lights turned green. They had succeeded. "That wasn't bad," Daniel said, limping over. Keanu smiled faintly. "I've spent years practicing fake danger. Today it finally meant something." When the team regrouped at the debriefing room, no one laughed at Keanu. Even Captain Moravec seemed impressed. "I'll admit it," Moravec said. "I thought you'd freeze." "You didn't." Keanu shrugged. "I was scared. But fear doesn't mean stop. It means listen." The Supreme Commander, General Briggs, walked in just then. He looked at the team and spoke simply. "There are people who wear uniforms and forget honor, and there are people who wear none but carry it everywhere." He looked directly at Keanu. "You don't need medals. You already earned the only thing that matters, our respect." The room clapped not out of obligation, but from truth. Later, back in the quarters, Daniel knocked on Keanu's door. "You're leaving tomorrow, right?" "Yes," Keanu replied. "Early morning." "Thank you," Daniel said, voice softer. "Now, not for the movies, but for staying, for not running when they mocked you, for proving that real strength isn't loud." Keanu smiled. "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." As the base lights dimmed for the night, Keanu sat alone on the bed, staring at the patch Daniel had given him. This trip was supposed to be one visit, one talk, but it had become something more. And in the silence, realized he hadn't just visited a base. He had found a family. Asterisk, when the alarm wasn't drilled, morning air was colder than usual, biting through even the thickest jackets. A layer of frost blanketed the runway as KeanuReeves stood beside his packed duffel bag, ready to board the military transport vehicle that would take him away from the base. He had already said his goodbyes. He had shaken hands with Daniel Weiss and thanked General Briggs for the opportunity. Even Captain Moravec had offered a firm, respectful nod. It had been a short visit, but it changed something inside him. He had arrived as an outsider. He was leaving as something else, someone who had earned quiet respect, not by pretending, but by showing up when it mattered. The engines of the transport plane began to rumble. Keanu took a deep breath and turned to walk toward the ramp when a sudden, loud alarm split the silence. It wasn't like the simulation drills. This alarm was different, turgent, piercing, and very real. Within seconds, soldiers flooded the area. Voices on radios shouted commands. Sirens blared. Her voice echoed through the base speakers. This is not a drill. Base lockdown in effect. All personnel report to defensive stations. Keanu froze. He turned to see Captain Moravec sprinting across the tarmac toward the command center, barking orders. Daniel ran up, panic in his eyes. You need to get inside now. What's happening? Keanu asked. Unknown aircraft detected near the airspace. Communications interference. NATO protocols triggered a lockdown. Keanu didn't move. What do you need? Daniel hesitated. We don't know what's coming yet, but they're calling up all available units for backup security. It's even reserves. It's even injured personnel. Like me. Keanu looked at him, then back at the chaos around them. I'm not leaving, he said. Daniel began. I'm not leaving. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. The base transformed in minutes. Armored vehicles rolled out. Snipers took positions. Emergency medical stations were activated inside the command center. General Briggs stood at the center of a tense group of officers. We don't know if this is an attack or a probe, he said, but we treat it like the real thing. Maintain calm. Protect the airfield. Protect personnel. Keanu was brought into the communications tent for safety, but he refused to sit down. He watched the screens, the movement of soldiers. The worry hidden behind years of training, sir, a young operator called out. We have visual confirmation. It's a small drone formation. Not NATO. Origin unknown. Civilian. Briggs asked too fast. Possibly weaponized. Just then, the screens flickered. Attack. Temporary blackout. Someone's jamming us, the tech officer said. Keanu stepped forward. Is there anything I can do? Moravec turned. This is a combat zone now. There's nothing you can, but then he paused. He looked at the patch. Still on Keanu's jacket, the one Daniel had given him. Actually, Moravec said slowly, there might be. They explained it quickly. One of the drone control centers was located in a tower on the far edge of the base. It was responsible for sending signals to disable threats. But the team there had gone dark after the jamming started. They needed someone to get there fast, check the equipment, and confirm whether the system could be rebooted manually. Every available soldier was already deployed, but Keanu wasn't just available. He had trained in tight quarters for years. He understood movement, mechanics, and had worked with tactical advisors on set who had trained real soldiers. And most of all, he had proven he wouldn't freeze 10 minutes later. Keanu was inside a Humvee driven by Daniel. You really don't have to do this, Daniel said. I know, Keanu replied. But someone once told me that staying calm in fear is a kind of courage. They reached the tower. The doors were open. Power flickered inside. Keanu moved fast, remembering everything he had learned: how to move low, how to scan for traps, how to breathe under pressure. They found 2 technicians unconscious live, but knocked out from an electric surge. Console screen blinked red. Daniel limped to the radio and tried to call it in, but the signal was still blocked. You'll have to do it from the panel, he said. It's a basic reboot, then override the block signal. Keanu stared at the panel. Lines of code. Blinking lights. Think of it like a movie set, Daniel said. Just hit your mark. Keanu cracked a smile. He breathed in slowly. Then started the reboot. The system hummed. But just then, the power cut out completely. Darkness outside. The buzz of approaching drones grew louder. Backup generator, Daniel said. Under the stairs. Keanu sprinted down, found the lever, and yanked it hard. Lights flickered. One by one, systems came back online. It's working, Daniel shouted. We've got visual again. Keanu ran back up. The screen now showed the drone swarm approaching the perimeter. But slowly shifting course, the defense system was online. He activated the disruptor signal. Outside, in the command tent, General Briggs watched as the drones scattered and disappeared. From radar, cheers broke out across the base. "We got them," the comms officer shouted. "Signal restored. Threat neutralized." General Briggs grabbed the mic. "Who reactivated the tower?" A voice replied over the radio. "Civilian volunteer, Keanu Reeves." "Silence then," the general whispered. "He didn't just visit us. He became one of us." An hour later, the base returned to order. Medical crews were treating the injured. The Supreme Commander arrived at the tower to see the damage for himself. He found Keanu sitting beside Daniel, both exhausted but alert. "You could have run," the general said. "I almost did," Keanu admitted. "But then I thought of Daniel and all of you, and I knew. I wanted to do more than just be thankful." The general extended a hand. Keanu shook it. "Today," the general said, "you earned something no actor can play. The respect of soldiers." That night, the base held a quiet ceremony. Keanu was given a patch-N, honorary one only, presented to civilians, but served alongside Nato in crisis. He stood quietly as it was pinned on his jacket. No speeches, no cameras, just real gratitude. As the soldiers clapped, Danya leaned over and whispered, "You saved lives today." Keanu looked at him and said softly, "You saved mine the moment you believed in me." The wind outside had calmed, but something powerful had stirred in every heart on that base, because one man chose not to leave. And in doing so, he became more than a guest. He became one of them. Headlines, backlash, and the shadow beyond the Besaitha next morning. Light filtered through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the NATO base. Everything looked normal. Again, vehicles moving, soldiers training, radio chatter filling the air. But under that normal rhythm, a buzz had started to grow. Whispers, nods, long looks in Keanu Reeves' direction, because now everyone knew what had happened. Overnight news of the drone incident had leaked not through official press, but through soldiers' texts and quiet calls home. And the detail that stunned people the most wasn't about the near attack. It was about the civilian who stayed behind. Keanu Reeves helps restore control during NATO drone incident. Actor praised by Supreme Commander for bravery during real-world crisis. John Wick. More like real-world hero. The headlines spread like wildfire and the world reacted. Some praised him. Some mocked him. Some questioned how an actor got involved in a military operation at all in the base cafeteria. Soldiers glanced up from their trays to watch a breaking news segment playing silently on the screen above. "They're calling it luck," Captain Moravec said, walking up beside Daniel and Keanu. Keanu looked at the screen where two news anchors were debating. "They always will," Keanu replied. "It's easier than admitting a moment changed them." Moravec paused. "For what it's worth, that wasn't luck. What you did took guts." Keanu nodded. "I didn't want to leave without doing something that mattered." Down, most people would have run. "I almost did," Keanu said honestly. "But then I thought, what if Daniel had?" Daniel, sitting across the table, looked up and smiled faintly. "I didn't," he said. "Because I remembered your scene, the one where you stopped breathing for a second, to remember who you were." Keanu met his gaze. "You remembered, and I learned." But even as the moment settled quietly between them, something darker was brewing beyond those secure walls. Later that afternoon, General Briggs called Keanu into his office. The room was quiet, blinds drawn, papers stacked neatly on the table. The general held a printed report in one hand, and his expression was hard to read. "We have a situation," he said. Keanu sat down across from him. "I'm guessing this isn't about more headlines." "No," the general said. "About what the headlines triggered." He slid the paper across the desk. Keanu read it. "Unauthorized surveillance of NATO base, anonymous breach attempt. Traced to private contractor. Someone tried to tap our security feed hours after your name hit the press," Briggs explained. "They weren't after our plans. They were after your movements." Keanu frowned. "Why?" Briggs sighed. "Some people profit from division. If a civilian gains respect in military circles, it threatens their control. You've become a symbol of unity, of humility, of unexpected strength. And some powerful people don't like symbols they can't control. Keanu leaned back. So, what now? We're tightening security, Briggs said. But more importantly, we need you to think carefully about what you do next. This isn't about movies anymore. You've walked into something bigger. Keanu looked down. The weight of the moment settled on him, not fear, but something heavier. Responsibility. I'm not running, he said quietly. Not now, the general nodded. Then we stand with you. Outside, the sky began to darken early. Clouds rolled in faster than usual, and snow started to fall again. The bass quieted, but tension hummed beneath every step, every breath, inside. The medical wing. Keanu visited the two technicians who had been injured during the drone event. They were awake now, groggy but recovering. You saved our lives, one of them said softly. Keanu shook his head. You were doing your job. I was just trying not to mess it up. The technician smiled weakly. You didn't. But as Keanu left the wing, he noticed something odd: a black civilian vehicle parked near the outer checkpoint. Not base staff. Tinted windows. No markings. He pointed it out to an officer who made a quick radio call. Moments later, the car pulled away, too quickly. They're watching. The officer said. Keanu exhaled slowly. That night, Daniel knocked on Keanu's door. Got a second? He asked. Keanu stepped aside. What's up? I wanted to give you something, Daniel said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. I wrote it after you visited the first day, before all this happened. Keanu opened it. A letter handwritten, it read. I didn't expect. You too care. I thought you'd give a speech, take photos, and leave. But you stayed. You didn't flinch when they laughed. You didn't hide when things got real. You reminded me that it's okay to be more than one thing. It's a soldier, a person, someone who feels, someone who heals. Thank you for seeing us, and for letting us see you. Keanu's throat tightened. He folded the letter and held it gently. Thank you for writing that, he said. Daniel smiled. You earned it. The next day, the base received a direct message from NATO headquarters. KeanuReeves had been officially invited to speak at the Central NATO Summit in Belgium, not as an actor, but as a civilian symbol of resilience, unity, and humility. General, Briggs told him quietly, this hasn't happened before. Not like this. Keanu looked at the invitation, then glanced out the window at the soldiers training, the medics working, mechanics repairing vehicles. I'll go, he said, but not to speak about me. I'll go to speak for them. Briggs nodded, then speak with honesty. The world needs that now more than ever. And so, once again, Keanu packed his bag. But this time, it wasn't a quiet exit. Soldiers lined the path as he walked toward the transport. Not because he was famous, but because he was real. And as the engines roared to life, Daniel handed him one last item, a small hand-carved medallion. It's from my grandfather, he said. He fought in World War II, he said. Only give this to someone who shows courage without a gun. Keanu took it with both hands. Then I'll carry it with respect, he said. As the plane lifted off the ground, cutting through the clouds, Keanu stared down at the base. Now quiet again, but the silence didn't mean nothing was happening, because sometimes the real war is not on the battlefield. Sometimes it's in the hearts of those learning to see each other again. Asterisk the speech that stopped the room. Air in Brussels was colder than Poland, but it carried a different kind of weight. This was not a military base tucked behind guarded fences. This was the heart of NATO. Men and women in suits and decorated uniforms walked swiftly through long marble halls, speaking in clipped tones about security, strategy, and alliances. In one of those halls, KeanuReeves walked silently, a humble figure in a black suit, no tie, hands in his pockets. He passed diplomats, generals, world leaders, many of whom glanced at him with curiosity, few with surprise, some with judgment. What was an actor doing here? A staff officer approached him. Mr. Reeves, they're ready for you. Keanu nodded. He was not used to this kind of silence. Not the silence of awe, but the silence of anticipation, of suspicion. Behind the double doors ahead was the NATO summits. Central chamber, a place where speeches were timed, polished, reviewed by advisors before being allowed on the record. But not this time. This time. The speaker had refused any script, and still, the highest room in the building had voted to give him the floor. The chamber was massive, circular, with rows of seated delegates from nearly every member country. Giant screens displayed live feeds from satellite locations. Military commanders sat beside politicians. Interpreters stood by in glass booths. Keanu stood alone on the center platform. The chairperson spoke into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, today we welcome a guest who was never meant to be part of military discussions, but who became one. Not through rank or title, but through action. Mr. Keanu Reeves, the floor is yours. Keanu stepped forward. No notes. No paper. Just truth. He looked at the crowd. Many waited with polite detachment. A few whispered to their aides. A few smirked. But Keanu didn't rush. He stood still for a moment, as if listening for something inside himself. Then he spoke. I don't know how to address a room like this, he began. I've spent most of my life reading lines that someone else wrote, playing characters who weren't real. And yet, in the last week, I saw something more real than anything Hollywood could ever write. His voice was calm, steady. I was invited to a Nato base as a guest. Some thought I didn't belong. Maybe they were right. But while I was there, something unexpected happened. A crisis, a real one. And in that moment, I saw what true courage looks like, not in the movies, not on screens, but in the hearts of people who didn't flinch. The room was still. Keanu continued. There was a young soldier named Daniel, but he had been wounded in combat, could have stayed in the background, unnoticed. But he stepped forward. Not because he was strong, but because he refused to let fear define him. And then there was a commander who trusted a civilian in the middle of a real threat, not because it was safe, but because it was right. He paused. I'm not here to talk about strategy. I'm not qualified for that. But I am here to talk about something I've seen disappearing, not just in military spaces, but everywhere. Humility. The word echoed. We've made power loud and made humility quiet. We've celebrated dominance and forgotten dignity. We've filled the world with voices shouting to be seen, and we've forgotten the power of those who show up quietly and act. On the screen behind him, the summit team began to project images from the base training drills. Soldiers helping each other, a quiet photo of Keanu sitting with Daniel. I was mocked when I arrived, and I understand why. I hadn't earned anything, but something changed. It's not because I fought, but because I listened. And when the moment came, I didn't freeze. It's not because I'm brave, but because someone else showed me what bravery looks like. He looked around the room. You make policies here? You move armies. You write the rules. But if there's one thing I learned at that base, it's this. Rules don't protect people. People protect people. Now. Not dismissive ones. Thoughtful ones. When you stop seeing the uniform and start seeing the person, you find something deeper than strategy. You find connection, trust, humanity. He glanced at the chairperson. I won't speak long, just long enough to ask something simple. Don't forget why you sit in those chairs. It's not to lead armies, not to outmatch your enemies, but to make. Sure, a soldier like Daniel never feels invisible, and to make sure kindness isn't seen as weakness but as strength. He nodded once. Thank you. Stepped back. The room remained silent for a second too long. Then clapping. Slow at first, then louder. Delegates rose. Not because they were told to, but because something inside them stirred, and among them, General Briggs watched silently from the visitor gallery. His eyes didn't sparkle. They steadied. This wasn't about Keanu becoming a soldier. It was about reminding the soldiers to remain human. After the summit, reporters flooded the lobby questions. Mr. Reeves. Did you expect that reaction? What made you step into danger back at the base? Do you want a political role now? Keanu stopped briefly and answered one question. I just wanted to honor a promise. That evening, as the city lights of Brussels flickered across the river, Keanu sat quietly in a small cafe near the embassy. Alone, but not lonely. A soft buzz came from his phone. A message from Daniel. Watched the speech. The guy stood up when you finished. You made us proud, Keanu smiled faintly. Then another message came. This time, not from Daniel. Unknown number. You've inspired the wrong kind of attention. This isn't over. Keanu read the words slowly. He looked outside at the dark street. He knew this would happen. When you speak truth into power, it doesn't just echo, it rattles cages. And some people don't like that. But Keanu leaned back in. His chair held the medallion Daniel had given him, and whispered to himself, "Good, let them come." Asterisk, the man who didn't flinch. 3 days had passed since Keanu Reeves delivered his unexpected speech at the NATO summit. 3 days since the world paused to listen. Not to a politician, not to a general, but to a man who had nothing to prove, and everything to give. But peace doesn't come easily when the truth touches power. Beneath the headlines, behind the applause and beyond the camera flashes, something darker had begun to stir. It started with a subtle shift, calls that were never returned, briefings that suddenly got canceled, interviews postponed for security reasons. And then came the anonymous threats. Not from loud enemies, but from shadows. Stay out of things you don't understand. The military is not your movie script. You got lucky once. Don't count on it again. Keanu didn't reply. He didn't post. He didn't run. He stayed still, and that made them nervous. On the fourth night, Keanu arrived back in Poland for a quiet ceremony at the same NATO base that had once doubted him. He was invited not as a speaker, not even as a guest of honor, but simply as a man who had stood beside soldiers when it mattered. Daniel was there, dressed in full uniform now, his limp less pronounced, his presence stronger than ever. The base was different this time. Warmer in spirit, if not in weather. Soldiers who once looked past him now saluted. Not because he was famous, but because he had shown what most didn't expect from someone outside the fence. An excitable loyalty. Keanu didn't wear a suit. He wore the same jacket he had worn that first day. Worn, simple, real. The ceremony was brief, just words of gratitude. A medal was placed in his hand, not to be pinned on his chest, but to be kept in his pocket. A symbol, nothing more. But to Keanu, it was everything. As he prepared to leave, Daniel walked him to the edge of the runway. They say, change happens. From the top, Daniel said. But what you did started here, with us, at the bottom. Keanu looked at him. That's where truth lives, he replied. At ground level, where people bleed, or people believe. Just then, an officer ran up, face pale, voice urgent. We have a situation, he said. Not a drill. The words hit like a brick again. Keanu's chest tightened. The base went into immediate lockdown. A vehicle. It crashed through the outer checkpoint 20 minutes earlier. It was stopped, the driver arrested. But inside the vehicle, investigators found something chilling: detailed maps of the base, footage of Keanu's movements over the past few days, and a list of known soldiers who had interacted with him personally, including Daniel. General Briggs, called back from another location, stood in the center of the situation room, fists clenched. This wasn't just a threat, he said. This was a message. Keanu stared at the evidence on the screen. Whoever this was, they weren't random. They were organized. They were watching. They wanted silence. What do we do? Keanu asked. The room looked at him, not with doubt, but with concern. Daniel stepped forward. You leave, Keanu. Go underground. Stop giving them something to chase. Keanu shook his head. They don't want me, he said slowly. They want what I represent. If I disappear, it tells them there. Right, that truth should hide. Briggs looked at him carefully. You realize this is no longer about speeches? This is about survival. Keanu nodded. Then let's survive loudly. A plan was made. Keanu would appear at a scheduled event at a nearby European Peace Institute. Not to speak about the attack. Not to talk about war, but to read letters from soldiers, from families. From people whose lives had been changed simply because someone like him dared to listen. The location was reinforced with both NATO and local police support. The stage was simple. The cameras were on. And when Keanu stepped up, the room held its breath. He didn't speak about himself. He read the first letter. Dear Keanu, my son watched your interview from the hospital. He said it was the first time someone made him feel like kindness wasn't weakness. Then the second. My brother served in silence for years. When he saw how you stood by Daniel, he cried for the first time in a decade. And then a third. Don't wear medals, but you carry weight. And the world needs more of that. Keanu folded the papers. I didn't come here to be brave, he said quietly. I came because someone once told me. If you see someone falling, you don't. Look away. The audience clapped outside, unknown to many. 2 suspects had been intercepted before entering the perimeter. They had knives, no, press badges. And on one of their phones was a message. Make sure he never speaks again.
Oh.
They were arrested without incident, but the world would never know their names, because what happened next was louder than fear. Within hours, videos of Keanu's reading spread across the internet. The hashtags returned. But this time, something new emerged. #Stand with Keanu #his courage without uniform. #humanitistringtell from every walk of life began sharing their own stories. Teachers, nurses, veterans, teenagers, about moments where someone simply showing up made all the difference. The movement became bigger than Keanu, and that was the point. Months later, Keanu was back in Los Angeles. His life had changed, but not in the way fame usually does. He spoke less in interviews. He traveled more quietly, but he still wore the patch Daniel gave him, not on his jacket, but in his heart. He visited schools, hospitals, sometimes anonymously. He didn't give speeches. He just listened. And every so often a young soldier would approach, quietly shake his hand and whisper, "You made us feel seen." He never said much back, but he always looked them in the eye. Always, and far away. In a dusty drawer at the Nato base in Poland, a small handwritten note remained on the bulletin board. No title, no author, just 5 words. The man who didn't flinch,